What happens when a leader runs out of money but still needs to keep a war burning? Inside Russia, the answers are exploding in fire, freezing in bank accounts, and now crossing deep into NATO airspace. Before this, destroys everything you thought you understood. Hit subscribe, smash the like button, and share this with someone who still believes the old headlines. For years, the story of this war followed a familiar rhythm. Advances measured in kilometers, casualty reports that blurred into statistics, front lines that barely moved for months. It felt to many outside observers like a stalemate that could drag on forever with no clear path to an ending. But underneath that surface, something else was quietly shifting. While the world watched the trenches, Ukraine was building a completely different kind of capability, one that did not need to capture territory at all. Let us talk about the fires first. For months now, Ukraine has quietly constructed something most people underestimated. Not a new army division, not a new tank brigade, but a weapon that needs no soldiers, no fuel convoys, and no permission from Washington. Long-range drones and missiles built inside Ukraine, flying deep into Russian territory, striking exactly what Vladimir Putin cannot fully protect, no matter how hard he tries. His money. Because a war does not run on soldiers alone. It runs on oil. It runs on steel, factories that never stop, banks that keep lending, and a government that can still pay its bills. That is precisely what Ukraine has begun to dismantle piece by piece, refinery by refinery, warehouse by warehouse. Russia operates around 26 major oil refineries. Together, they process roughly 5.12 million barrels of crude every single day. That is the beating heart of the Russian war machine. Oil pays for missiles. Oil pays for soldiers. Oil pays for the propaganda that keeps ordinary Russians believing this conflict is worth fighting. Ukrainian drones have now hit a massive share of that refining capacity. At the worst point, close to 45% of Russia's normal refining output was knocked offline in a single stretch. Today, only about 1 in 3 of the refineries that got hit has fully recovered. Almost half are only partly working. More than a quarter remain dead, silent, and useless. Think about what that actually means. Russian fuel production fell by roughly 22% in June alone, and by around 8% across half a year. That is not a small dent. That is a nation slowly losing the ability to fuel its own war. And here is what should truly worry the Kremlin. Ukraine is not slowing down. It is accelerating. Strikes that once needed to happen near the border are now reaching targets more than 500 kilometers away. Some even past 2,000 kilometers. Places like Tyumen, cities so deep inside Russia that 3 years ago, nobody would have believed a Ukrainian weapon could reach them. Now those cities burn too, because that is where Russia refines its fuel, processes chemicals, and builds parts for its weapons. Even further north, in a region called Kamaisk, some of Russia's most important oil infrastructure has gone up in flames. This is not random destruction. It is targeted, patient, and devastatingly effective. Now consider the cost math, because it should terrify any finance minister in Moscow. A single Ukrainian long-range drone can cost a few $100,000 to build, yet it can destroy a facility worth over $100 million. That is not a fair fight. That is a losing trade, repeated over and over every single week. Russia has 11 time zones to defend. You cannot put enough air defense around every refinery, every warehouse, and every fuel depot across a country that enormous. Something will always slip through. Ukraine only needs a handful of successful strikes each month to keep bleeding the Russian economy dry. There's also a hidden cost that rarely gets talked about, the price of defending against attacks that never even land. Every time Russian air defense detects an incoming drone, even one that gets intercepted, the response is not free. Sirens sound, airports shut down, factories pause. Air defense missiles, some costing more than the drone they shoot down, get fired into the sky. Multiply that by dozens of alerts every week, and you see how even a failed attack drains money and resources from a system already stretched thin. Meanwhile, Ukraine's production is only growing. One Ukrainian company alone is now producing around 100 long-range missiles a month, aiming for over 1,000 a year. Weapons capable of flying close to 1,800 kilometers and carrying warheads over 1,000 kilograms. Russia simply does not have a way to match that pace, and everyone inside the Kremlin knows it. So if you have been hearing certain voices in the West insist Russia is winning this war, ask yourself whether they are looking at the actual numbers or repeating a talking point. Because the battlefield of factories, fuel, and finance tells a very different story. Think about how different this war looks compared to 3 years ago. Back then, most people imagined tanks rolling across open fields, soldiers digging trenches, and slow grinding battles measured in meters of land. That image is not wrong. The trenches are still there. The front lines are still brutal. But it is incomplete. The most decisive battles of this war are increasingly happening far away from any front line at all. They are happening in refinery control rooms, in shipping manifests, and bank ledgers, and in the quiet panic of executives trying to figure out how to keep a company solvent. This is what modern warfare actually looks like in the 21st century. You do not need to occupy a city to break its economy. A single drone built for a fraction of the cost of the target it destroys can achieve what an entire army division once needed months to accomplish. Every one of these strikes is calculated. Ukrainian planners study supply chains, trace which refineries feed, which military units, and identify which warehouses double as logistics hubs. This is economic warfare executed with surgical precision, and it is forcing Russia into a position that no amount of propaganda can fully hide. That story gets even darker once you look past the refineries, straight into the Russian financial system itself. So if you have made it this far, do me a favor. Share this video with one person who still thinks Russia's economy is untouchable. It takes 5 seconds, and it genuinely helps push the real story further than the propaganda. Let us talk about a company called Wildberries. If you're not familiar with it, think of it as Russia's version of a massive online shopping platform, something like Amazon, except woven deeply into everyday Russian life. Millions of people use it to buy clothes, electronics, and household goods. Tens of thousands of small sellers depend on it for their income. But Wildberries was not just a shopping app. Its massive warehouse network was also quietly being used to support Russian military logistics, which made it, in the eyes of Ukrainian planners, a legitimate target. 8 of its major warehouses have now been destroyed or badly damaged. That single decision wiped out close to 20% of the company's total storage capacity. Nearly 2 million square meters of warehouse space gone. Around 97,000 individual sellers were affected. Many of them were small business owners who had no connection to the war at all, but whose entire inventory simply vanished overnight. Wildberries is now scrambling. Reports suggest the company is even looking at renting warehouse space across the border in Kazakhstan, hoping distance might offer some protection that Russian air defense clearly cannot provide. But here is where the story turns from a business problem into a full-blown financial crisis. Wildberries owed enormous debts to Russian state banks before any of this happened. Hundreds of millions of dollars in loans. Now, with warehouses destroyed and inventory gone, the company is edging closer to a real risk of bankruptcy. And when a company that large owes that much money and suddenly cannot pay, the damage does not stay contained. It spreads. More than 300 companies connected to Wildberries and similar logistics networks have already applied for repayment relief after losing stock in these strikes. Sberbank, Russia's largest bank, majority owned by the state itself, has publicly agreed to delay repayments for some of these struggling businesses. Now stop and think about why a bank would do that. Banks do not delay loan repayments out of kindness. They do it because they know the alternative is worse. If hundreds of companies default on their loans at the same moment, the banks could face a liquidity crisis. There is an idea that fits perfectly here. When you owe the bank a small amount of money and cannot pay, that is your problem. When you owe the bank an enormous amount of money and cannot pay, that becomes the bank's problem. Right now, across Russia, that problem is multiplying. It is worth pausing to think about who gets hurt first here. Not the generals, not the officials making decisions about the war. It is small business owners, warehouse workers with no shifts to show up for. Families who ran modest online shops through Wildberries built up over years, only to watch their stock disappear overnight. These are not the architects of this war. They are simply standing closest to its economic shockwaves. That is the quiet brutality of economic warfare. It moves from a burned warehouse to an unpaid loan, from an unpaid loan to a nervous bank, from a nervous bank to tighter lending across the entire country. And this is happening while other sectors of the Russian economy are already slowing down hard. Growth in electronics and optical manufacturing has collapsed from close to 12% down to just over 4%. Growth in military-linked metal production has been cut nearly in half, falling from around 18% down to under 9%. Every one of these numbers points to the same uncomfortable truth for the Kremlin. The war machine is running out of room to keep expanding because the money and materials behind it are being burned away faster than they can be replaced. Now let us step back and look at the bigger picture, because this is where things get genuinely alarming for Moscow. In just the first 6 months of this year, Russia's government ran a budget deficit of around $77 billion. Compare that to the country's available liquid reserves, roughly $46 billion. Do the math, and Russia's deficit already exceeds its spendable reserves by more than $30 billion in half a year alone. It does not stop there. Russia's planned defense budget for this year sits at roughly $166 billion, nearly 3.5 times larger than what remains in its reserve funds. On top of that, analysts expect additional emergency military spending somewhere between $50 and $64 billion, which alone could equal more than the entire remaining reserve fund. Add it all together, and total Russian war spending has now crossed roughly $747 billion. That number is almost impossible to picture. So here is a simpler way to think about it. For every single dollar of spendable reserve Russia has left, it has already spent more than 16 fighting this war. That is not a nation confidently marching toward victory. That is a nation burning through its savings account at a terrifying speed, hoping something changes before the money runs out completely. To put this in everyday terms, imagine a household that spends 16 times its entire savings just to keep up appearances. No family survives that long without something breaking. A country is not so different. It just has more tools to delay the reckoning and more ways to hide the pain for a little while longer. Russia has used those tools before. During earlier waves of sanctions, the government leaned on wealth funds, currency controls, and redirected trade. Those strategies bought time. They did not solve the underlying problem, and now the room to maneuver is shrinking fast. If this breakdown is helping you see past the headlines, smash like and subscribe. This is exactly the kind of analysis that changes how you understand the world. Before we go further into how deep this crisis is cutting into ordinary Russian families, I want to pause and thank everyone who has been supporting Ukrainian causes directly. There is a fundraising effort mentioned in the description below supporting Ukrainian soldiers, and it is closing in on an incredible milestone. If you have a few dollars to spare, even a small contribution adds up when thousands of people give together. Every bit helps real people going through an unimaginable situation. Now, I am back to the numbers because they are about to hit much closer to home for millions of ordinary Russians. When a government runs out of money, it has choices to make. It can cut spending, it can raise taxes, or it can quietly start looking at the money sitting in its own citizens' bank accounts. Russia appears to be leaning toward that last option. New rules have been introduced that give Russian banks far more power to restrict how much money depositors can withdraw. In simple terms, the legal guarantee that your money is instantly and fully accessible whenever you want it is being weakened. Banks are gaining more legal room to slow down or limit withdrawals, especially large ones. Why would a government do this? Because officials can see what is coming. A country moving toward broader military mobilization creates a very natural reaction in its population. People want access to their savings. They want the ability to move money, convert it to stable foreign currency, or simply have cash on hand in case they need to leave quickly. A government worried about capital flight and bank runs has a strong incentive to trap money inside its financial system, locked in local currency. For Russian families, this creates a quiet but very real form of fear. Save your whole life, work hard, build a modest cushion of money, and now face the possibility that accessing it might not be as simple as walking into a bank. Combine that anxiety with rising talk of expanded military mobilization, and you get a population that is growing uneasy in ways very hard for any government to fully control. Picture an ordinary family far from Moscow, a father who works at a factory, a mother managing a household budget, 2 teenage sons approaching the age where a mobilization order could reach their door. For that family, abstract statistics about deficits and reserves become deeply personal. It becomes a question of whether a knock on the door means a summon to the front line. This is the quiet undercurrent beneath every official statement coming out of the Kremlin right now. Officials talk about stability and resilience, but adaptation and desperation can look remarkably similar. And the policies being rolled out tell a story very different from the confident narrative on state television. Tighter withdrawal restrictions, expanding conscription, and harsher penalties for draft evasion are the new reality. There is a reason authoritarian governments rely so heavily on controlling information during moments like this. When ordinary citizens cannot easily compare notes with each other, fear becomes easier to manage from the top down. When independent journalism is suppressed and dissent carries real legal risk, the narrative is easier to maintain. But fear managed from the top is still fear. It still erodes trust. It still pushes capital toward the exits. Whether that capital is money quietly converted into foreign currency, or it is simply people quietly deciding that leaving the country is safer. This is the part that connects everything together. Stay with me here, because this is the moment where economic pressure turns into a dangerous political decision. A leader facing a shrinking treasury and a nervous population needs something to shift the national conversation. Something that redirects fear away from empty bank reserves and toward an external threat instead. Something that justifies tighter control and a public more willing to accept sacrifice because they believe a bigger danger is standing at the door. And that brings us to Poland. A Russian military drone crossed roughly 100 kilometers into Polish airspace, deep enough that it cannot be dismissed as some accidental drift near a border. This is not the first time Russian aircraft or drones have tested NATO airspace either. It has happened before, quietly, repeatedly, almost as if Moscow is running a series of experiments to see exactly how far it can push before facing real consequences. And so far, the consequences have been limited. Strong statements, diplomatic protests, and warnings, but nothing that has meaningfully changed Russian behavior. Here is why that pattern matters so much right now. An incident like this does 2 very convenient things for a leader under pressure at home. First, it gives him a powerful tool for his own population. Suddenly, the story is not about failing refineries or trapped bank deposits. It becomes about a supposedly aggressive NATO alliance edging closer to Russian borders, a narrative that can justify martial law-style restrictions, expanded conscription, and tighter domestic control, all wrapped in the language of national defense. Second, it puts pressure on the exact alliance currently supplying Ukraine with the weapons burning down those Russian refineries. If NATO countries grow nervous enough about direct confrontation, public opinion in the West might start questioning continued military support. That hesitation becomes Moscow's best hope for slowing down the very strikes that are dismantling its economy piece by piece. Because, make no mistake, less Western support for Ukraine is one of the only realistic paths left for Russia to relieve the pressure it is under. The battlefield is not offering Moscow a breakthrough. The economy is not offering relief. The only lever left to pull is trying to fracture the resolve of the countries supporting Ukraine from the outside. This is why a provocation near Poland should not be viewed as a random, isolated event. It fits into a larger pattern of a government trying to convert battlefield losses and economic desperation into political leverage. Using fear as a substitute for strength it no longer fully has. There is also a colder, more calculated layer here. Every time Russia probes NATO airspace and faces no meaningful cost, it learns exactly where the threshold sits. That is not accidental. It is method. Each time the response stays limited to words, the next probe tends to go a little further. 100 kilometers into Polish airspace today does not guarantee restraint tomorrow. It is far more likely to be treated as a green light than a warning. For NATO members, this creates an uncomfortable dilemma. Respond too softly, and the pattern of testing continues. Respond too aggressively, and Moscow gets exactly the confrontation it can use to justify total mobilization at home. Finding the right balance between firm deterrence and avoiding unnecessary escalation is one of the hardest calculations any alliance can face. And it is precisely the kind of uncertainty a struggling regime hopes to exploit. If you are starting to see just how connected all of these pieces really are, take a second right now to hit that subscribe button. The burning refineries, the collapsing warehouses, the trapped savings accounts, and now a drone deep inside NATO territory all tell one story. This channel exists to connect these dots clearly without spin, so you actually understand what is happening instead of just reacting to headlines. Now let us talk about what this actually means going forward, because understanding the pieces is only useful if we understand where they are leading. Russia today is not operating from a position of strength. A country confident in its military and economic future does not need to threaten its own citizens with restricted bank withdrawals. It does not need to send drones deep into the airspace of a nuclear-armed defensive alliance just to generate a domestic distraction. Those are the actions of a government trying to manage decline, not a government marching toward victory. Every dollar Russia spends defending refineries that keep burning down anyway is a dollar it cannot spend on offensive operations. Every warehouse destroyed adds another company to the list of businesses begging banks for repayment relief. Every delayed loan payment adds pressure to an already fragile banking system. And every restriction placed on ordinary citizens' savings chips away just a little more at the quiet trust that keeps any financial system functioning. None of this guarantees an immediate collapse. Governments under economic strain have survived for years by squeezing their populations harder and controlling information more tightly. Russia has significant tools available to delay a full-blown crisis, but state media and financial regulations only buy time. Selective repression can suppress open dissent, but it does not solve the underlying problem. There's a difference between delaying collapse and reversing decline. Right now, Russia appears to be doing the first while struggling badly at the second. And that distinction matters enormously for how this war likely unfolds from here. A country fighting to win looks for opportunities to expand, to break through, and to seize new advantages. A country fighting to survive looks for ways to freeze the situation in place, to buy time, to wear down its opponent's patience rather than defeat its opponent's army. Everything we have walked through today points toward the second version of Russia. A Kremlin managing crisis after crisis, hoping that Western unity cracks before Russian reserves run completely dry, hoping that a provocation near Poland creates enough hesitation abroad to offset the fires burning at home. The real question is not really about Russia's intentions anymore. Those intentions are becoming clearer by the week. The real question is about everyone else watching this unfold. Will the countries supporting Ukraine understand what a provocation like this Polish airspace incursion actually represents? A sign of weakness disguised as aggression rather than backing away from support at the exact moment it is proving most effective. Because if the numbers we just walked through tell us anything, it is this. The strategy of hitting Russia's economic foundations is working. It is not a theory. It is showing up in refining output, in loan default requests, and in reserve funds shrinking faster than anyone projected. Wars are not won only on battlefields. They are won in budgets and in banks. They are won in the quiet moment when a government realizes it can no longer afford to keep fighting the way it has been. Russia is edging closer to that moment with every burning refinery and every empty bank vault. History shows this pattern again and again. Empires and regimes that looked unshakable on the outside were often hollowed out. The numbers underneath were already telling a completely different story. A move near a NATO border does not change that. If anything, it confirms it. A confident government does not need distractions or gambles with an alliance capable of ending it. Only a government that feels the walls closing in reaches for a move that risky. So here is where I will leave you today. A regime that once spoke confidently about total victory is now managing bank runs and rationing withdrawals. Gambling with airspace incursions near the most powerful military alliance on Earth is not the behavior of a winner. That is the behavior of a government trying to buy itself just a little more time. Whether that time runs out sooner or later depends heavily on what happens next on the battlefield and in foreign capitals. History has a habit of remembering these moments more clearly than the people living through them ever do. Years from now, this exact stretch of time may be remembered as the turning point. The moment when refineries stopped rebuilding faster than they burned, and when banks stopped being able to absorb bad loans. When ordinary Russians started asking harder questions about where their money and their sons were actually going. No empire in history has ever collapsed from a single dramatic blow. They erode. They crack slowly in places nobody is watching. Eventually, the cracks connect, and the whole structure gives way at once. A burned refinery here, a delayed loan repayment there, a restricted withdrawal in one city, a quiet conscription notice in another. Individually manageable, but together they outline a system running out of road. And that is exactly why a reckless drone flight over Polish airspace matters so much right now. It is not a sign of confidence. It is a flare sent up by a government that knows exactly how thin the ice beneath it has become, hoping the flash of danger distracts everyone at home and abroad from noticing just how close that ice is to breaking. There is something bigger at stake here, too. The way this war ends will shape how future conflicts are fought. If economic pressure and precision strikes prove capable of bringing a major power to its knees, the lesson will be universal. That lesson will not be lost on governments watching from Beijing, from Tehran, and from capitals around the world. This is a preview of how power itself might be contested in the decades ahead. That is exactly why the next few months matter so much. Every refinery that stays offline adds another layer of pressure. Every loan that goes unpaid and every family moving savings adds to the strain on a system struggling to hold together. And every hesitant response to a provocation like the one near Poland sends its own message. One that either strengthens Moscow's gamble or exposes exactly how weak that gamble really is. Now, before I finish, let me ask you directly. Drop a comment right now telling me how you think this war ends. And more importantly, share this video with someone who still believes Russia has the upper hand. The truth deserves a bigger audience than the propaganda does. Keep watching closely, because stories like this rarely stay quiet for long. New reports come in every week. New numbers, new strikes, and new signs of a system straining under its own weight are appearing daily. What looks like a slow conflict from the outside is actually one of the fastest moving economic collapses in decades. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next one.